Welcome back to another Honda video. In this episode we have a lot to go over, restoring a bunch of parts, painting a bunch of parts, including the bike frame itself, restoring the main seat, taking a look at the brake caliper, the brake rotor, the master cylinder. We ordered a lot of parts online. We rebuilt the fuel petcock. Just overall a lot of things that got restored, a lot of parts that got ordered to try and keep the momentum going while I have some time right now. So without getting into too much detail, I do have a couple things that I'm a little bit ahead of myself on for this episode, so I want to keep them out of frame. But without getting too far ahead, let's just go ahead and get started with the episode. Let's start off from the beginning of painting the frame. I've got the frame coated in about 3 coats of rust inhibitor to help prevent rust from showing back up. Now what I'll do is work my way around the entirety of the bike, covering it in some Rust-Oleum fillable primer. This primer is great for when you still have some micro scratches that need filled, but don't really want to bother with any body filler. For my purposes, this was more than okay. For the filler primer, I wasn't too concerned if there were some spots a little bit thicker than others, since I would be sanding it down smooth. I also don't mind if some areas have gotten a little bit messed up from touching or laying on angles to get that full coverage. I wound up doing 3 coats of this primer, and I think it turned out pretty well, all things considered. Now the frame is ready for wet sanding. While I give the frame a few hours to properly dry, I turn my attention to the brake caliper. This has really seen some rough days, and the paint is in bad shape. First thing I do is get the caliper pistons out by soaking them overnight and then applying about 60 psi to the inlet of the brake while covering the end with a piece of wood so they don't go flying out. I then taped these pistons to a socket and cleaned it on my drill with some Scotch-Brite. Next came using my bench grinder to remove old loose paint off the caliper. I want to emphasize I only really cared about loose paint because there are lots of difficult nooks and crannies to get into. Quite frankly, I really don't need this caliper to look perfect, and I'm going to put primer over it anyway, so I wasn't terribly worried. Just don't actually drop the caliper on the floor. Once I have a better grip on the situation, I finally take the time to properly get all the rest of the loose paint off the caliper to get it ready for priming. Once I had it all cleaned up, it looks infinitely better and is finally ready for its first coats of primer. The caliper and bracket both get 3 easy coats of self-etching primer from Rust-Oleum. Nothing crazy going on here, just want to make sure I don't let it drip so it won't actually have to sand down all of these parts. Next up, before painting the frame, I go over it with 400 and 800 grit wet sanding paper. Again, the only areas I really care about is where you can see the frame where everything is mounted on. I don't need to wet sand in unseen areas. It then gets blown dry with an air compressor in the output of my vacuum cleaner to make sure it's completely dry. Alright, here we go. Finally ready for paint. Did some wet sanding, and I'm just ready to have this thing painted. Move on with the build, you know? Let's get cracking. So now it's on to painting the frame. I'm using Stops Rust High Gloss Protective Enamel paint from Rust-Oleum. One thing that I, and probably many other people, try to do on the first coat is get absolutely perfect coverage. We want that first coat to be nice and shiny and perfect, but I always have to remind myself that I don't want to do that, otherwise I'll have drips all over the place. I'm doing nice, even, light coats to prevent this. I believe I wound up doing 3 light coats and 1 light to medium coat. This was unfortunately difficult to do because any direction I lean the bike to get better coverage messes up the previous areas I painted. In hindsight, I probably should have made a mount for the frame to hang from so I could get cleaner coverage, but overall I'm very satisfied with how the paint came out. It also became a little bit difficult walking around the frame with the tarp sticking to my shoes, so I need to think of a better solution for that in the future. At this time, I also painted the brake caliper parts with the same kind of paint and painted some of the side covers with another high gloss black paint. All the parts then get 3 coats of high gloss clear coat. I've read different opinions on how or when to do this, but my technique is to let the last coat of paint dry for 10 to 15 minutes and then apply your first coat of clear. These coats should be medium coats and be given about 15 to 20 minutes to dry. When all is said and done, you should get a nice glossy and smooth finish. For some of the parts, you can sand with 1000 or 2000 grit and buff afterwards to get rid of any orange peel, or to get a seriously glossy finish. But for the frame and caliper, I'm really okay with how these all turned out. Next up was taking a look at my brake rotor situation. Seen here, you can see the ends of the rotor are tapered up a little bit. This is sometimes called dishing, like a dinner plate does. I know this bike has some weird quirks to it, but I'd never seen anything like this before and decided the rotor was probably toast. You can see in this clip the rotor has some serious run out as the lathe tool goes from the inside to outside edge. Getting a new but still used rotor that's nice and flat solves this issue for me. I'll be turning this down on the lathe later to get a smooth finish. Next up is tackling the seat. It's a little difficult to see here, but the material is falling apart, and whenever you grab it, material flakes off. I removed the countless staples from underneath to reveal a pretty good condition seat foam. I ordered new seat leather and had my friend help me install it. This took many staples, lots of clamps, lots of stretching, and a lot of patience. But overall it looks 10 times better and even has a nice Honda logo on the back. Next up is cleaning some of the steering parts. These were cleaned up on the bench grinder with a wire wheel. The oil cooler had the pipes removed and cleaned up as well. All of the parts then got taped off and got ready for priming and paint. I followed the same basic steps as before, with rust inhibitor and Stubbs Rust gloss paint, followed by clear coating. I don't claim to be a pro painter, but I have done this quite a few times now and have gotten the hang of it for what I'm doing. The secret to good paint work is in the prep work, so take your time with nice easy coats and make sure you don't get any running. Next up is the fuel petcock, which is really grimy and has definitely seen better days. I took this apart and soaked it in some rust remover overnight and cleaned it up with a bristle brush. Afterwards, it looks good as new and is ready to be reinstalled. I just need to find some fuel line for it. And that's pretty much it for this episode. Next episode, I will be tackling installing the engine back into the frame with a friend. This took a few tries with all the crazy angles and trying not to hurt our backs. We also had to be careful with the freshly painted frame, so definitely be sure to stay tuned for that video. See you guys in the next episode. Thanks for watching.